Intel is the most mentioned semiconductor company in current market coverage. 95 references in a single news cycle, an unusually high number relative to every one of its peers. That level of attention is not generated by momentum or euphoria. It is generated by uncertainty. And in markets, uncertainty of this magnitude around a company this large only exists when a genuinely consequential decision is still unresolved. Here is the core judgment up front. Intel's restructuring is not primarily a cost-cutting story. It is a strategic wager on whether a legacy chip designer can reinvent itself as a contract manufacturer. At the precise moment when the entire AI economy is desperate for an alternative to Taiwan Semiconductor. If that wager succeeds, Intel becomes critical infrastructure for the next decade. If it fails, the company faces a fragmentation that no operational efficiency program can reverse. The market cannot price this correctly yet, because the outcome depends on variables that have not resolved. That is why the mention count is 95 and climbing. To understand what is actually at stake, you need to understand where Intel stands in the current semiconductor landscape. The articles in this news cycle describe a world of explosive AI infrastructure spending. Hyperscalers are projected to spend up to $690 billion on AI infrastructure in 2026 alone. Broadcom just reported AI revenue more than doubling to $8.4 billion in a single quarter. TSMC remains the world's dominant contract chipmaker, described in recent coverage as being so far ahead of its closest competitors, Samsung and Intel, that it is a linchpin of the entire semiconductor market's growth. That phrase, Samsung and Intel, placed side by side as TSMC's closest challengers, is doing a great deal of work. It is telling you that Intel is not currently in the same tier as TSMC. It is the closest alternative that exists. And that gap is precisely what Intel's Foundry strategy is designed to close. The Foundry pivot, Intel Foundry Services, the effort to manufacture chips for external customers the way TSMC does, is the most ambitious industrial transformation any American company has attempted in a generation. It requires Intel to simultaneously maintain its own chip design business while building a services culture that is structurally opposite to the vertically integrated model it operated under for 50 years. That is not a reorganization. That is the equivalent of a professional sports team trying to become the league organizer while still playing in the games. Now here is where the AI arms race narrative intersects with Intel's story in a way that most coverage is not connecting clearly enough. The articles describe a world where AI chip clusters are ballooning past 1 million chips, where Broadcom is projecting over $100 billion in XPU revenue for fiscal 2027 alone, where Anthropic has placed a $21 billion order with Broadcom for custom chips, where Meta just committed $27 billion to a single NeoCloud capacity deal, where the Texas Power Grid interconnection queue has swollen past 230 gigawatts, with wait times exceeding 5 years for large customers. This is an industry operating at the absolute frontier of physical constraint. Every single one of those chips, whether it is an NVIDIA GPU, a Google TPU, a custom ASIC from Broadcom, needs to be fabricated somewhere. TSMC fabricates the overwhelming majority of them. That concentration is a strategic vulnerability that governments and hyperscalers both recognize. The United States has made it explicit policy to develop domestic fabrication capacity. Intel is the only American company with the existing infrastructure, the engineering base, and the capital access to potentially fill that role at scale. This is the structural fact that makes Intel's situation different from a typical turnaround story. It is not simply trying to win back market share in a competitive industry. It is trying to become critical national and commercial infrastructure at a moment when demand for that infrastructure is historically unprecedented. The question is not whether the need exists. The question is whether Intel can execute the transformation before its balance sheet forces a different outcome. Here is the reversal card. The point that almost no one is stating directly. The conventional narrative around Intel is that its foundry strategy is risky because it is expensive, and because TSMC has an insurmountable lead in process technology. That is true, but it misframes the actual risk. The deeper risk is a leadership and accountability problem of exactly the kind that the Accenture and Wharton research describes in a different context. That report, released this week, makes an observation that applies directly here. It says that intelligence may be scalable, but accountability is not. It argues that as systems become more complex, the human decision-making layer becomes more consequential, not less. Intel's restructuring is a system of extraordinary complexity. It involves simultaneous decisions about process node development timelines, external customer acquisition, manufacturing yield improvements, workforce reductions, capital allocation, and government subsidy negotiations, all of which interact with each other in nonlinear ways. The leadership decisions being watched right now are not primarily about strategy. They're about whether the accountability structure at Intel is capable of managing that level of complexity without the kind of cascading error that compounds across interconnected systems. One wrong call on node timing affects customer acquisition. One lost anchor customer affects the business case for the next capital raise. One delayed subsidy negotiation affects the timeline for everything else. This is the hidden convergence point. The Foundry strategy, the leadership decisions, and the Q1 guidance revisions that are driving Intel's current mention count are not three separate stories. They are three readings of the same underlying question. Does Intel have the organizational capacity to hold itself accountable across a transformation of this scope? That question does not appear on any earnings slide. Now let us run the two scenarios honestly, with both paths visible. If the Foundry strategy gains traction, meaning Intel secures one or two significant external anchor customers for its advanced process nodes, demonstrates competitive yield rates on its most recent node, and maintains its timeline for the next generation, then the story changes structurally. Intel stops being a legacy company in decline and starts being a domestic alternative to TSMC at the exact moment when AI infrastructure spending is at an all-time high. The government subsidy context, the national security framing, and the sheer scale of unmet demand for fabrication capacity would all become tailwinds. Every hyperscaler that is currently locked into a single supplier would have a reason to diversify toward Intel. Under this path, the current uncertainty premium in Intel's valuation compresses, and the company's strategic position becomes genuinely defensible. If the Foundry strategy stalls, if node timelines slip again, if key customers defer commitments while waiting to see proof of execution, if the cost structure of running both a design business and a Foundry services business proves unmanageable simultaneously, then the pressure to separate the two becomes overwhelming. A split may not be a failure in the long run, but the near-term disruption of a separation event, combined with the capital requirements of each independent business, creates a scenario where Intel's competitive position in both design and Foundry weakens before it can stabilize in either. Under this path, the TSMC comparison in recent coverage, describing Intel as a distant challenger rather than a peer, becomes the defining market narrative for years. Neither scenario is inevitable. Both are live. The evidence that would resolve the question, anchor customer announcements, node yield data, Q1 guidance language around Foundry commitments, is precisely the information the market is waiting for. That is why 95 mentions is not noise, it is signal. The one-line wrap-up is this: Intel is not a turnaround story or a value trap. It is a real option story, and the option it is holding is one of the most strategically valuable in the semiconductor industry, provided the organization can execute before the clock runs out.